Welcome to Advancing Cyber, where we explore the critical cybersecurity issues shaping today's geopolitical and business landscapes. Each episode brings together leaders from cyber law, policy, and technology to offer insights that cut through the complexity of the digital age. I'm Cristin Flynn Goodwin, a cybersecurity law and incident response expert. In today's episode, we'll explore the highly debated question, should we hack back as part of offensive cyber operations? And if so, how far should we go? Every few years, this topic reemerges as major attacks hit the headlines. And in 2025, this unsettled debate has definitely reemerged. Fortunately, we have two experts to help us unpack hacking back and offensive cyber operations. Today, we are joined by Nathan Case and Stacy O'Mara. Nathan is currently the Vice President of Cloud Computing and Cybersecurity Solutions at Clarity, and he wears many hats across the cybersecurity space. He serves as a cyber advisory board member at Bain Capital Ventures, a member of Security Tinkers, a cybersecurity lead with the U.S. Air Force, and a faculty member at IANS. Before working with the U.S. Air Force, Nathan was a security advocate at Datadog and Senior Director of Security Operations at Resilience. He had 5 years in leading security roles at AWS and is also the co-founder, CEO, and CIO of Rampart Hosting, LLC for almost 9 years. Stacy O'Mara is currently the Senior Director of the Cybersecurity Services Group at Venable, a terrific law firm in Washington, D.C. Stacy's career began on Capitol Hill as a congressional research analyst, and she has since held pivotal roles supporting the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security, as well as advising the U.S. military and leading government affairs at Mandiant and at FireEye. Her strategic advocacy has secured millions in funding for cybersecurity initiatives and fostered transformative partnerships across the public and private sectors. I have also worked incidents with Stacy, and I know she's great in a crisis. As always, the comments you hear today may reflect legal opinions, but do not constitute legal advice. So, how did we get here? Governments have always had offensive capabilities. We hear about nation-state activities all the time. Russia's Nobelium, or as they're now called, Midnight Blizzard, attacked SolarWinds. The Chinese Salt Typhoon attacks on our nation's telecommunications systems. These are all examples of offensive nation-state attacks. Part of the conversation in D.C. is whether the United States needs to be doing more or having the authorities to do more offensively. It's an interesting question. On the corporate side, companies are tired of being hit by ransomware actors and having data stolen and the criminals evading arrest. They're frustrated by nation-state actors gaining access to their systems. There's a frontier call for justice and an interest in hacking back, going after the bad guys, or at least stopping them from using the data they stole by stealing it back, disabling the system, or encrypting the data and prohibiting its use. There are a lot of reasons why that feels great emotionally, but why that may not be such a great idea in practice. So let's jump right in. Every few years, the call to allow the private sector to hack back comes back to the policy table for discussion, and we are certainly in one of those cycles right now. So, Nathan, can you help us start by re-leveling the playing field? What happens if a company hacks back? So technically, a company has its information stolen. What would a company be looking to do then if it were to hack back?
It's an interesting question. Realistically, I've met a lot of people that really, really want to shoot at Cyberly from a cyber point of view, the company that actually was shooting at them from a cyber point of view. And that's a great concept. It feels very stand your ground, castle doctrine, United States, off we go. And this makes sense when we're in a physical reality at some level. I can at least argue that, hey, if person doing bad thing to me is doing bad thing to me, maybe I should stop them. The downside of hackback, the downside of the cyber world is that you can't always pick your targets, and you don't always know that the person that is doing a thing to you, the network connection that you have coming into your system, is actually the person that's really responsible for it. So in many ways, as we think about hackback becomes this concept of how do I set up a thing so that we can either recover that information or encrypt that information so that we can potentially stop the network flood of traffic that we're getting. But the realities of the generalities of this concept, it's been around for a while. I mean, we had a firewall in the early 2000s called Sidewinders that would literally hack back magically for you. These things have gone away for a reason. And I'm going to let Stacy go ahead and talk to us a little bit about the not so vague realities of things like a Sidewinder now.
Yeah, I mean, why is this restarting now, Stacy? What's driving this?
Yeah, I mean, Cristin, thanks for having both of us. And I think you're fleshing out an important piece of this whole conversation, right? And so I'm grateful that you're even pulling us together to have the conversation again. I mean, Nathan's right. This has been around for a while, but the discussion has evolved. And I think we need to have a broader conversation about what it means today and why we're having it today. And then more broadly, what are the overall objectives of deploying any type of quote unquote offensive cyber operations or active defense measures? So just zooming out for a second, I think we're hearing a regurgitation and renewing the debate on whether or not private sector companies and the US government should be involved in offensive cyber operations because of the evolving threat landscape, right? We're in what is actually could be considered a continuously new era of digital conflict. The cyber attacks are no longer just, people sitting in their basements, hands on keyboard. We're looking at long-term, persistent, strategic campaigns from nation-state actors on the nation's critical infrastructure. And I think revelations around Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, these really stealthy state-sponsored operations by China, where they are embedded across U.S. utilities, transportation networks, telecommunication systems, our supply chains. This is heightened alarm within government and industry as well. So I think we've got lawmakers out here right now, kind of to using Nathan's analogy, saying, what are we going to do to punch back at China, right? Like they keep punching us in the face. How much longer are we going to take this? And what can we do collectively to punch back? These adversaries are not just probing our systems, they're establishing these really long-term footholds inside them. So the call to embrace these offensive cyber capabilities have definitely grown louder over the past several months, including different proposals on how to involve the private sector directly. And there are a lot of consequences for doing that and a lot of things that we should talk through as a cybersecurity community and as a government on why we should or shouldn't be doing this and how we might deploy those capabilities safely and effectively. But to Nathan's point, there are other things that we could be talking about as well. This has been framed under a larger deterrent strategy against China, but there are other things that we could be considering as well as a cybersecurity community, which is maybe focusing on defensive measures. There's a lot that we can be doing here jointly. And I think we need to have a thoughtful conversation about why we would start using offensive tools now and how maybe they're just one toolbox out of many that would be complementary to other things that we already have the capability and the desire to start using.
I understand that it may be a paraphrase of a quote, but I understand that there's a quote from Mike Tyson that everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. And so I sort of wonder as we think about hacking back, it sounds like this great idea, but I just feel like so much could go wrong. And so, Nathan, I just envision that if a company goes to hack back, how do you know you've got the right server? How do you think about collateral damage? Like, what happens if you get it wrong? Can you talk about just how do you have operational precision on that and what happens if you don't?
So let's think about it from a government level real quick. So let's step back. And I mean, I'm going to say something here. I don't think this is a surprise, but the United States is a national asset, right? So like there are nation state actors from the United States, just like there are nation state actors from China or anywhere else. They are individuals that, due to the authority in that nation, have the right to function in an offensive nature against another country. That is a national asset doing a national thing. That makes sense. When those things happen, there is a significant amount of time, planning, effort, understanding, recon, and everything else that goes into the planning of a mission. Just like you would be flying a weapon, an airframe, take your pick of thing, to another place to do a job. And the difference between a government doing that and a civilian organization doing that is much the same as, frankly, an actual army deploying in appropriate logistical fashion with appropriate strategy and tactics planned, readied, and honestly just ready to go out to the battlefield. And I'm going to say this and be a little bit harsh about it, but a bunch of civilians with rifles hoping to God that they could do a thing. So It's really that level of difference. And the honest reality is that as we look at what hackback looks like from the concept of actually impacting the world around us, I have a friend that once put it to me like this: if you're going to write a rule around hackback, instead of saying hacking or cyber or any of these other things, use the word nuclear and see how you feel about it.
Thought.
And it really does kind of put it in its place, because the reality is that you don't know what you're actually hitting. None of the IP, none of the geo IP information is horribly accurate. None of the things that you're aiming at, none of the things that you're doing are particularly well known to you, because you don't actually have the intel. You don't actually have a mission plan. You don't have any of those things. You're doing a thing because you're angry and because there's a thing that you want to go do. And none of those things, none of that ever ends in happy. All of that ends in oops. And as we think about the things that we look around about, I mean, like, I'm going to say something and I'm assuming that Stacy will have a retort. But the honest answer here is that as we think about what that means, effectively, a private company would suddenly be, I don't know, in conflict with the Rome Statute from 1999. And you would be breaking Article 8. You would be knowingly attacking a civilian. And that, my friend, is a war crime. Oops. So that's kind of a big deal. And we have to evaluate how we're doing a thing so that it is actually an appropriate and programmatically done thing, and not just, hey, y'all hold my beer.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Nathan. I mean, this is a strategy, right? And it needs to be thought out very carefully and looking at all of these consequences, right? I mean, using offensive tools could potentially deter adversaries and neutralize those threats, but it raises a lot of concerns about escalation of an ongoing event, attribution, and then, as you kind of alluded to, that collateral damage, right? Like inadvertently harming innocent parties or foreign entities that actually aren't responsible at all for those malicious activities. And then you pile on top of that the legal and ethical dilemmas. And then it also raises this question of, are we bypassing international norms? Are we setting precedents internationally? What does this mean for international partners or other adversaries outside of China? I mean, there are several risks to walk through, and I'm happy to do that, Cristin. All that to say is that there are a lot of risks associated here and a lot of things that could be harmful and go wrong, but there are ways to do this in a safe environment with the right expertise, with the right tools, with the right coordination with the governments, both here and with partners abroad. But it's going to take a lot of time to suss all of that out and really think critically and put some safe guardrails around some of these activities.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because I do think there are enough companies who want to explore this that the topic keeps coming back. It's back on the political table yet again. So if a company wanted to explore, that they're worried about getting compromised and they want to have the right to go hack back, then what would we want them to be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, look, here's the reality. When you think about a private sector company taking on this responsibility, first of all, maybe there's an altruistic component to this, right? Like a shared national security mission where they want to do the right thing to help the nation, help others within their sector, help the cybersecurity community in general. But in reality, we're dealing with, in a lot of cases, CI, critical infrastructure owners and operators who don't have that experience, who are not going to take that burden on, who will never get approval from their general counsel to assume that level of risk, who will never, right, who will never get approval from their board, as they think about how this would impact them in the market. These are publicly traded companies, right? So there are a lot of other questions that come into play about taking on, as I mentioned again, one tool out of a larger tool set, and how a company might decide to defend itself or help with a collective defense for the country in general. I mean, like, I'll just run through. Let's talk about the consequences really briefly. The legal exposure, right? So the offensive actions could violate domestic or international laws. If any foreign entities or individuals are inadvertently harmed, they could seek legal recourse, leading to really expensive litigation or diplomatic fallout. Okay, think about that for companies who are operating around the globe. Secondly, collateral damage. Malicious cyber activity, and Nathan can speak to this better than me, relies on compromised infrastructure such as botnets, which may be owned by unwitting third parties. So disrupting that infrastructure could cause unintended harm to innocent actors and further strain international relations. Then you have reputational and diplomatic consequences. The offensive operations could be perceived as unprovoked or aggressive and could damage the United States' standing or escalate other geopolitical tensions. Ukraine and what we're seeing with Israel and Iran could easily fall in this category. Also, normalization of offensive tactics. All right. Again, like setting that precedent. If major nations and influential companies start embracing these types of operations, could it legitimize and proliferate this type of behavior around the globe and enable less responsible actors to adopt similar tactics without sufficient oversight? Like, are we just opening a massive can of worms here? And then finally, the other risk that I would put out there that companies would be taking into consideration is risk of retaliation. If you're engaging in these active cyber defense measures, how likely does that increase the likelihood of counterattacks? How much is this volleying back and forth going to last for? And then again, further perpetuating, other targeted entities from allied actors and like escalating the threat landscape further than they actually intended. So that's a lot for a company to assume and to absorb. Not to say that there aren't some out there that wouldn't be willing to do it. I mean, candidly, we've heard from some companies, some vendors out there who have the capabilities and who have that national security mission mindset that they would be willing to take on some of this risk. Now, I think they would do that in conjunction with support from law enforcement and from the government. They need that safety net. I don't think they'd be out here as cyber cowboys kind of doing it entirely on their own and don't want to be cyber vigilantes. But I'll say this over and over, guys, during our session, it has to be done in a very closely coordinated fashion with the appropriate government agencies.
And I'd like to tie into that for a second.
I think your pup had an opinion on that one, Nathan.
Well, she actually didn't like the Amazon delivery person, but that's neither here nor there, really. But if you don't mind if we jumping into that, so I completely agree with Stacy on this. The unintended here is insane. There is a push right now for hackback. Interestingly, I don't know if you guys are familiar with U.S. Cyber Command. So U.S. Cyber Command is, and I quote, to direct, synchronize, and coordinate cyberspace planning and operations to defend and advance national interests. So that's actually the government organization that's supposed to do this. And they do actually have a commercial outreach arm, and they will happily talk to you. And some of the things that we're talking about today honestly push towards this concept of, hey, by the way, let's go ahead and work with commercial and set this up in a safe, clean way so that we can actually do operations that legitimately do stop things like botnets. As we think about the things that are out there, that's like this much of the whole mess, though. And so as we get into how this actually works in reality, having some level of coordination that actually allows us to come together and do a specific mission so that we can catch. Maybe it's just cyber criminals in take your pick of country, or maybe even the United States. That's a big deal. And being able to work across those types of different Article, 10, 18, and 50, and being able to deal with the concepts of who actually has responsibility and remit to do a thing allows Cyber Command effectively to help commercial do the thing that they need to do. And we don't have hackback. We don't have random hold my beer sorts of folks jumping around and doing a thing, and because it's not helpful and it just makes more of a mess. And I think to Stacy's point, well, once we do it, everybody else will do it. And so you may as well go ahead and replace the word cyber with nuclear, because that's where we're going.
But I think what we're missing is the fact that if the U.S. is in an offensive position, they are not going up against U.S. service providers, because in the most part, you don't have U.S. service providers in Russia, China, Iran, or North Korea.
But most of the cyber attacks come from U.S. East 1.
So where I'm going with this is that if you have hacking back and you have private sector companies that are launching attacks, they're going to be coming from most of the large hyperscale cloud providers. Yep. So the U.S. companies are going to see them launching outbound. It's a violation of terms of service right there. And they're probably going to be seeing them on infrastructure that is visible to those companies. So it will be on infrastructure owned and operated by one of the US hyperscale cloud providers somewhere. So I also have to wonder how that doesn't become something that a Mystic or a Mandiant or a Google Tag or the AWS security folks aren't then disrupting and then taking down the very customers who are hacking back in the first place. Like you end up in this self-licking ice cream cone of problems of the company that was harmed that wants to hack back has now violated its own terms of service and now is finding themselves at risk of being deplatformed for breaking into jail. So does that actually work? Or are we just adding to the analytical skills? Or maybe this will be low-hanging fruit for a Mystic or a Google Tag. But, Nathan, what do you do with that technical?
And that's why I bring up the cyber command portion of this, where we have some level of coordination. We don't have a bunch of people just doing a thing because they think it's the right choice. I mean, most of the attacks come from, like you said, a US hyperscaler. It is what it is. Why? Because I can give you a $25 prepaid credit card and get whatever the hell I need. Whoops. So it doesn't really work anymore. And let's be frank as well. Let's take a step back and even look at this whole thing and go, okay, so yeah, things happen, people do things, cyber attacks happen. Sure. I want to get this straight. Now you're asking me to spin up a totally new skill that I get that your dude in the IT room says, man, I'm a hacker. And that's sweet. But the reality here is that he's not, she's not. That's not really what's going on here. They're a really intelligent, really special, really good person at doing the job they're doing probably. And I support that. That's wonderful. There's a totally separate set of skills that they don't have. Let's also be frank that I can't get you to do basic hygiene on most of the cyber stuff that you do today. So bullshit, you don't have the time and energy and money to go do offensive cyber operations and do them well. You can't even do the basic.
Come on.
I know it really, but but honey, no.
Yeah.
And it really turns into this question.
You're bringing up such a good point here on the different models of how this might actually work, right? I don't disagree with you. You've got the public-private partnership that exists at Cyber Command under the NSA is the Cyber Collaboration Center, where there are certain companies that opt into this voluntary sharing apparatus where some of this work could be done, right? It's not right now categorized as offensive cyber operations, but the cybersecurity services and support and the information sharing that they are providing under that structure on the peripheral helps inform what Cyber Command might be doing from an offensive perspective. And there is memorandum out there that allows DoD to perform those type of operations, but it has nothing to do with the private sector right now. So from a policy perspective, I think we will see DoD and under this administration take a look at that. We are hearing rumors of legislation coming out that would grant liability protections or extend them to private sector companies to do this type of work. But there are models in which this could work to address some of what you all are discussing. And Cristin, we've heard from a major CSP that has basically been like, no way, we would never agree to do this. We don't want our infrastructure being used for this type of activity, right? But so the public-private partnerships piece, that's definitely one model. And Nathan has already alluded to that, expanding or modifying these existing models that allow private sector companies to engage in active cyber defense. However, with federal support and the right legal protections and operational guidance. You need that internal infrastructure, that skill set from the government and that protection to do it successfully. The other one kind of goes to the skill set piece that both of you mentioned, right? It is a very specialized skill. So first, does this actually help support and grow a specialized market for offensive cyber services, right? We have a niche cottage market that comes out with certain type of licensing and accountability mechanisms that allows a CI owner and operator to hire someone to come in and perform this kind of work. And then to that end, could you have another model, could you have a group of pre-vetted companies that are authorized to conduct these type of very specific cyber operations under federal oversight? And then another model that we've kind of heard percolating around during this conversation is, What would it mean to have a dedicated cyber force? Establishing a government-led cyber unit staffed with those very specialized skilled operators and governed, again, by a very robust legal and operational framework. My common thread here is that the government's involved and they've got the right legal protections and authorities available to private sector companies. Otherwise, I just don't see how a private sector company would be incentivized to do this at all.
Is 1,000% correct. But I know that there's going to be some person out there that goes, God damn it, the bureaucracy. And like, dude, that's the point. The whole point here is that there's bureaucracy so that it does slow down. We're not looking to make this go fast. We're looking to make this go smooth. And to go smooth, we have to do these things to make sure that all of the right things outcome here. Now, to your point as well, I actually work for a company called Clarity. Clarity Innovations is focused on working with the government, doing different things, right? One of the things that I've been asked to do because of being a cyber operator and doing the things that I do is to take this concept of what does it look like from an offensive cyber thing to basically turn back to commercial and go, hey, we actually know what we're doing. We're really, really freaking good at it. Let us come help you. And so I'm spinning up the cyber defensive or the defensive cyber portion of our company right now. And that's a new thing from the point of view of, yeah, we're going to do things like red teams, but a little different. And we're going to start focusing on different partnerships that we can pull into the commercial world because this turns into the type of thing that is quite a bit bigger than one company or one group of people. This is something that we all need to learn how to do. So working with a lot of those companies is important.
I think one of the challenges in the public-private partnership space that we haven't really unpacked is the agency problem. And we do need to be careful where private sector companies cannot be acting as agents of the government. And
well, you can act as an agent, but you can't act under authority to push the button. That's where it gets really funky.
That's right. Yeah. And so it's important for companies that want to have that actionable and operational independence, if they are hacking back, to be collaborative, maybe deconflict, but not to have that effective control from the government. And so that's where hacking back gets really tricky. Like, what would happen if, for example, a company says, we're going to go after this server because this actor has exfiltrated our data and it's there, and we're going to go encrypt it so that nobody can use it. And so they go and tell that government agency, and it gets shared. And the government agency freaks out because they've been up on that server for 6 months. They've got a whole operation built around it, and they've got all sorts of downstream things they want to go do. That's a conflict. And so those situations will happen as we think about increasing the hackback skills and enabling more of this oversight in government agency. And when you have companies that are not used to this sort of space, and you've got the well-intentioned but non-expert empowered individual who's wanting to go and have that frontier justice, I think it's going to make that public-private partnership or collaboration really challenging. And so I'm wondering, can you really have a public-private partnership in this space with non-experts? Or is this a space where you can only have frequent flyers?
I think it's totally cool to have non-experts. And like, to be fair, you're going to have a whole segment. I'm sorry, I don't know if this was aimed at you, Stacy, but I think it's totally fair to have individuals that work for, I'm not going to use the specific name, but some level of a cloud provider or some level of a super provider that has the ability to go do a thing. And they need to go work for the government when that happens. And there needs to be some level of partnership there so that the knowledge that that person has, which is exceptionally specialized, is able to be used in an appropriate way to stop a thing from happening. But I think part of what you just frankly touched on is what happens when and I'm just going to use Cyber Command, what happens when Cyber Command has a thing in play, and the reality is they're willing to take the damage for a minute, because the honest answer here is they've got a longer term strategy that you, the really nice gentleman from Illinois, has no idea about, and you're just pissed off and you want that to stop. And I get it. And that's a whole separate thing. And there's no good way right now to handle that. And there is Cyber Command is the place, in my opinion, that ought to go, but that's not a thing right now. And those The whole thing is just we need to get to a point where we have the ability to unify and deal with it. During your question, I was looking at some of my notes, and there's a book that was written a long time ago about what's fair in war and what's the appropriate thing. So like jua et bellum and jua in bello. And what is the appropriate action that you're allowed to take in war? And what does that actually look like? And if you haven't done that reading and you don't know what book I'm talking about just by those words, you probably don't have any business trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I think that's an important part of this whole dialogue too, is like what's considered a proportionate response, right? And I think it's hard for that nice guy at the company who maybe came across something and might want to do something isn't necessarily in a position to do anything with it. And I mean, this actually almost like takes me back to some of the conversations that we've had around disclosure, right? You have CI owners and operators or private sector companies who, you've got IT staff or a cybersecurity team that is looking at weird, traffic, and they don't even know what they're looking at. It could be so sophisticated that they don't know what to do with it, and they could turn it over to the government or share it with the government to try and ascertain like what's actually going on here, right? Like this was part of the whole impetus for the disclosure conversation after SolarWinds. So I think it is useful, to Nathan's point, to have like those non-sophisticated participants in some of these public-private sector models, because they might be the victim of something that they don't actually know what they're looking at. And so even sharing just one bit of information with the CCC at NSA, for example, or even if they were doing it through JCDC, through the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative at CISA, which is also the entry point for gathering cyber threat intel from private sector companies, could be a potential like useful piece of information. But then, you're getting into the whole question about, can staff within the government ingest all of that? What are they doing with it? Do they have the capacity? Can they contextualize it, anonymize it? Does it actually fit with everything else that they're doing? I think the more important piece is, you don't want to miss a bit of information, or you don't want to include or exclude a bit of information that could potentially impact an ongoing investigation by law enforcement, right? That's why the coordination is so important. On one hand, it could help. On the other hand, it could completely throw off some type of operation that the FBI might already be moving out on with respect to a particular incident or actor.
Well, but we also want to be clear too, when we start crossing the lines of authority here. So it becomes a problem when we don't have the ability to, or we shouldn't have the ability as an let's pretend the CIA for a moment. The CIA isn't allowed to work on specifically U.S. citizens inside of U.S. soil when they've broken the law. That's not what the CIA does. That's what the FBI does, and that's why they're there. So how do we handle that cross connection of authorities? How do we handle the ability to go from, is that 18 to 50, Stacy?
Yeah.
I think so. Apologies, I always forget which one's whose. But the point being, there's actual authority that someone has that they literally have to go talk to a different person and have that other person do the thing, because they don't have the authority to do that. It doesn't really work that way. It's not like the movies where you just look, you slide around, you look at the guy and you point and he hits the button and everything goes away. It's this big, long bureaucratic process because it needs to be.
But I think that's one of the best parts about government cyber operations, is that it is a process. One of the things that I really came to appreciate in all of my years working with the threat intel community through my time with Mystic and at Microsoft was learning about the fact that every nation state attack is a tasking from a government agency or official that gets passed down and operationalized, and it has an objective, right? And it is assigned out to go meet a particular objective. Maybe it is to maintain presence. Maybe it is to be destructive. Maybe it is to collect intelligence. Maybe it is to do something else, but it is a tasking. And so when we think about offensive cyber operations for government, because these are all attacks against private sector infrastructure, because most of the time government services are running on private sector infrastructure. What does that mean for how we think about offensive cyber? Because, they really are, in my mind, these are operations. Is this the right way to think about this, Nathan? Am I missing pieces? Is it more nuanced than this?
Posse comitatus is the thing. We're not allowed to, as U.S. military things, we're not allowed to go attack U.S. citizens things. And the biggest issue we have here right now, frankly, is that U.S. resources, things that are in the United States on U.S. soil owned by U.S. peoples, are being suborned by individuals from another nation and potentially doing inappropriate things that are well beyond EULA to things in the United States. And to your point, like as we talk about critical infrastructures, we talk about things that are legitimately right at the edge of, dude, this is a breach of Article 8, 100%, this potentially Article 7 even. This is a crime against humanity if the Chinese or the Russians or the North Koreans or this week the Iranians decide that they're going to take out a water treatment plant. That's a problem. So as we think about these things and as we think about who needs to deal with these things, one of the bigger discussions right now is, can we open up posse comitatus so that U.S. Cyber Command, U.S. cyber actors, U.S. cyber offensives, defensive specialists can go in and clean out some things that are potentially sitting in different cloud providers or different hosting providers that are technically on U.S. soil, technically owned by U.S. people, but being utilized by a third party. And that is a huge...
Posse comitatus becomes posse come and get us. So is that... sorry.
Yes. That's nice.
So is that... Because we keep hearing about the need for more offensive U.S. cyber capabilities. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, it's two different things. Like that's a defensive thought, right? Like we've got to figure out how to clear that. So from an offensive defensive game here, if we think about this, how we're going to fight with this battlefield. And this is a cyber war, folks. Sorry. We actually have people in our critical infrastructure that could technically kill millions of people, and we don't want that to happen. So we're going to defend ourselves. So the question is, how do we push out? How do we actually set up some level of border foundation for us to begin to defend the United States? And so this is an interesting question. As we push beyond that, and we think about offensive cyber, yeah, that's a totally separate thing as well. But we have to figure out how to deal with offensive cyber inside, defensive cyber inside, so that we can push out and actually have some level of a reasonable discussion about it. And right now, it's pretty messed up.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Nathan. I think we do need to take a look at our defensive measures here at home. They're getting everybody to the same level of basic cyber hygiene is critical. I mean, there are so many variances across all the sectors. I do think that's an area where we need to be spending some time, but both of you have alluded to having a plan and a process in place for how we would actually deploy offensive capabilities. And that's where I think we need to start, because in all the conversations, even just this conversation today, and all the conversations I've been having over the past several months, it's very confusing. We don't have a shared taxonomy around offensive cyber operations, right? Like there's not a
just defensive side. I would be happy with defensive cyber operations first, but yeah, take your pick.
Yeah, but like there are no standardized definitions around like active defense or offensive or deterrence or disruption, right? What are the objectives tied to those? You know, is there a meaningful distinction between offensive and disruptive capabilities? And so I think until we get to this common language and framework, it's going to be really difficult for us to start assigning, instances in which we might want to start deploying these types of capabilities.
Stacy, I love this point. And, the governments have gotten together to talk about offensive and cyber engagement from a military perspective. And we have the Talon Manual 1.0 and 2.0. And one of my biggest criticisms of that has been that the private sector doesn't have a seat at the table. And I've been told consistently that the private sector shouldn't be there. These are governments and they set the rules of engagement, and that private sector doesn't have militaries. And my view is that's all well and good, but your cyber operation is my term of service violation and I have the legal right to unplug it. So good luck with that. We have the ability to disrupt. And so let's see if we can have a Talon 3.0 where we're bringing both the governments and the industry to the table to actually have a discussion about what is active cyber defense, what is active defense more broadly, what are offensive operations from a private sector perspective, and what does that look like? Nathan, you look cynical on that point.
I'm going to push back. I don't think the CSPs actually have the visibility to see that. And I say that with knowledge of the CSPs. I don't think they actually have the visibility to differentiate between... Stacy, I'm going to utilize you and Cristin for a moment as different types of actors, but let's pretend for a moment that Stacy is a badass hacker and she's going to totally do a bunch of scary things. That's great, but Cristin's just running a company. And so what do you both look like to AWS or Azure or GCP? Honestly, if you do it right and Stacy's really good at her job, it doesn't look any different on the traffic monitors.
Mileage
That's
is going to vary. That's a valid point, right? There's an art and a craft to nation state attribution. There's no question about that. So it's not to say that it's an easy answer. However, I do think that there is more that needs to be done. And I don't think there's an easy answer. And I like where Stacy's going, because hypothetically, if Russia has another offensive attack against Ukraine, not Petya, and it has significant cyber effects in Poland and knocks over a bunch of Polish critical infrastructure. Poland has a government-to-government decision of what it may choose to do, but citizens and companies in Poland have a lot less recourse and a lot fewer options. And so I like the idea of continuing to dialogue and think about where companies need to go, or what options may be on the table. I mean, in part, is this a get off my lawn problem? If we are improving the rights or authorities for companies to be able to act, are we giving more authorities to the big platform providers to do more, or increasing reporting of these incidents to these companies so that they have more data to do more? What do we make the service providers too powerful in that regard? What is this? Where are we going from here to help this balance?
Cristin,
Stacy?
that's exactly right. Like, I think it's a balance, right? Like, you don't want to put too much power, to use your term, into the hands of these larger CSPs. But just doubling back on a point you made, several instances ago, that I take issue with the private sector not having a seat at the table for these conversations, right? Like, especially following the war in Ukraine, there's been an acknowledgement, I think, in the international community, at least from my experience supporting a cybersecurity company that was hands on helping the Ukrainian government during that geopolitical event. There's been an acknowledgement that the private sector has capabilities that are not the same for governments, right? And that, yes, the authorities are obviously there for the government, but they are very complementary, being able to share the capabilities and the cyber threat intelligence that comes out of some of these cybersecurity companies. Just anecdotally, and this is, again, goes back to the public-private sector model and the partnerships and why this is so important, right? Like, during the war in Ukraine, we were going over and meeting with NATO partners, and there was a consortium of cybersecurity companies that were doing all types of work, operationally there. And I remember we met with some of the NATO liaisons to Ukraine, and we were sitting in the room, and they basically were like, you guys were there in the beginning hours of the war, and if it weren't for you, we would have fallen to the Russians. Now, they've got a good cybersecurity capability there. They were defending themselves really well, but they were doing that in conjunction with several private sector companies that had threat feeds and different types of services that were directly impacting their own government-led mission on a day-to-day basis. So those partnerships, that insight is super critical right now. And there was an article today, and it's very vague, but talking about the relationship between Israel and U.S. cyber defenses, right? That has been a long-standing relationship that had some type of impact during this recent event with Iran. Anecdotally, that's just another example. And this goes to what I said at the top of our time here, Cristin and Nathan, is that we're looking at these massive geopolitical events, and having private sector companies involved in some way to help complement what a government is doing from a cybersecurity defensive posture is important. There are certain capabilities, and look, no one has a complete picture, right? Who has a complete threat picture of everything that's going on every system and every sector and every network and every region of the world? Being able to come together and create that common operating picture, and then using it in an effective way to get after these threat actors, and not only to deter, disrupt, but to impose costs and to prevent them from doing this again down the road, is super important.
Stacy, do you have a law degree?
I do not.
Okay, I was going to say. Looked like you were a lawyer. I was hoping you were a lawyer.
I was going to say, I don't think our privacy friends would ever let us aggregate that sort of data. There's no, we had this conversation back when we were first like pre-DHS, post 9/11, the White House wanted this concept called the Global Early Warning Information System, or
Yes.
GWIS. And
Yes.
it was this, it was an interesting concept, but even then it was this, and then John Poindexter, Total Information Awareness, TIA, a few years after that. And so the concept of the all-knowing has also, like hacking back, had its moments in the sun and it's never emerged. Nathan, I wanted to ask you, operationally, we've seen the US government and governments generally have been really strong in cyber offense, but what we haven't seen governments be able to do very effectively is use their capabilities to have a major impact against cyber crime. We've seen this huge wave over the past couple of weeks from Scattered Spider. And, we can debate how skilled these guys are. They seem to be having components in the United States and the United Kingdom based on the TI report. But how do we deal with the fact that when we're looking at the hacking back conversation from the private sector side, it's both nation state and cyber criminal. Offensive cyber is largely nation state from the government perspective, but yet largely, yes, cybercrime is a national security issue that came up in the past couple administrations, but it's still at the edges. So what do we do with the fact that we don't have the resources to disable cyber criminal activity at scale, and it is pounding on global private sector entities right now? I mean, these extortion attempts are massive.
So let me answer this in two different ways. The first way, the reason I asked Stacy if she was a lawyer is because I'm looking for a lawyer. I'm looking for not like that. I'm looking for a lawyer because realistically, on the last question and the last things we were talking about, one of the issues is that right now the CSPs, and it kind of plays into this one, are having a hard time understanding legally what they're allowed to do. There's a lot of things in the EULA, there's a lot of things that you agree to as a customer of a CSP that nobody really does because nobody understands the legal ramifications for opening up your stuff and seeing stuff and evaluating it for security purposes. And so consequently, legal goes just bananas. And that's fun. And it's great to be in those rooms and sit there and go, but that's not how it works. But the reality is we desperately need legal specialists, legal people to help from the commercial point of view, explain what's actually okay and how can we do these things and how can we share that data. So that's the first answer.
Yeah. Nathan, if you find yourself in those situations, Advanced Cyber Law is here to help. Now, returning to our program.
That'd be great. If you could help Cristin, that'd be wonderful. If you don't mind. No, seriously, please call Cristin. That's a legit, ask. If you're a lawyer at a CSP and you don't understand what the technical guy's talking about, find her, call her, ask her. Anyway. What was the first? I totally forgot the second question. The second question was, how do we deal with
the cybercrime at scale problem?
Right. So I would tell you that it's not cybercrime anymore. I don't believe pre the Russians invading Ukraine and actually changing things. What I would tell you is what I've seen on the backside of this is a lot of those cyber criminals became not cyber criminals, but actually just paid for nation state actors. And that's a really weird thing to do because all of a sudden we basically have non-standard troops doing a troop thing and suddenly they're military combatants potentially. Now, how do we focus on that as is that a violation of something? There's all sorts of legal questions that come up there. The reality in my mind is, unless you can prove to me that it's not a nation state, it's a nation state right now. And I know that sucks, but shrug. And so consequently, if somebody is doing I'm just going to go through and spam a bunch of email, basically spear phishing or whaling a specific contact at a specific company, and that's what we're doing, and that's the way we're going to make money this week, cool, you're a nation state actor.
So if that is the case, then it sort of makes the problem worse. Because from an offensive cyber perspective, if under your approach, all of the Scattered Spider actors are nation state actors, then let's get Matthew Broderick in and go play global thermonuclear war. Why wouldn't that happen? I think that the harder reality is that there is a finite number of cyber actors on behalf of the US government that can actually go and find the forensic evidence, go and collect, go and do something. And so it's an interesting thought to treat cyber criminals as nation state actors. And it's hard to see how far you get in the ring of that group before that falls out. Interesting thought. Either way, it's pounding on companies and there's no immediate solution.
And that's where we would go back to, that's why something like a cyber command, that's like something why a CISA should be, and I agree that this is not CISA's mission. I'm not stating that it is, but rather there's an argument for making something like this CISA's mission, or something like changing cyber command so this is cyber command's mission. And I think that's a reasonable argument.
Yeah, going back to some of the points that Stacy, you were raising early on, having that public-private partnership for more offensive capabilities to go after this sort of attack against critical infrastructure, I think that's not getting surfaced, and it's getting a little bit lost in this debate. Is that something that you think we should be bringing to the forefront?
Yes, absolutely. I'm personally, after working in policy and national defense for 20 plus years and cyber for the past decade, I don't think that you can establish a public-private sector model without input from the private sector on how it will actually work, right? And it needs to be bi-directional. There needs to be value add on both sides of the equation. I mean, it's not just about private sector giving the government all this information for them to go off and do things, but in return, the government needs to help those entities be safe and secure. And I think this is just one way to build long-term resilience. And all of this is bringing up like a bigger question for me too. And this again goes back to that question of the taxonomy and what is our overall objective here? And if it's really just, to punch China in the face, like maybe there are other ways that we can be doing this outside of cyberspace that might or might not involve the private sector, right? Like what other policy levers are out there? What other diplomatic tools are out there for us to be deterring and fighting back against this nation state that's wreaking havoc in our systems? And private sector does have a place at the table there to have that conversation, 100%.
Well, I think you're raising an interesting point, because I am a little worried that as we come into the era of agentic AI and we're in this pre-quantum space where diplomacy is not yet working. And we've seen a lot of energy in the diplomacy space being focused on no private hackback. We saw that from the Paris call for trust and security in cyberspace when that was launched back in 2018. We've seen the Pall Mall process coming up in the UK, and they're doing great work trying to discourage commercial cyber intrusion capabilities. And I think that's wonderful, but we're going to see AI putting accelerants on the ability to create new cyber offensive technologies. And quantum will accelerate that even more. So how do we start to think about the fact that tools and techniques and procedures are going to be invented for a whole new era and wave of attacks that we haven't even thought about yet? And it's going to enable smaller and smaller nations or municipalities or regions or zones to be able to engage in attacks, which is what NSO Group brought to folks who didn't have the money or the skill sets to do this for themselves. And AI is going to enable a whole new wave of attackers that didn't have the money or skills to be able to do that sort of thing.
That already happened. We're already past that. That is past tense.
Yeah, I mean, but it's going to scale even further. And so, and we're going to see a much deeper commercialization wave of that, because the victims don't yet trust interacting with the technology. So it's not ubiquitous enough for victim engagement to be high. So we'll get there, but I think it's all in test phases now. And the quantum stuff hasn't happened yet, but it will. So what do we do about diplomacy when we've got this new wave of attack activity coming? We know that there's fear of growing commercial cyber capabilities in this space. And yet governments are going to continue to buy this stuff because it enhances their capabilities at a more effective price point than developing it and building it themselves.
Yes.
Great.
That's a problem. No, we've got no solution.
Okay. Well, then let's go to Paris and talk about it, because we can keep this conversation going over there. It's really nice.
So seriously though, historically, I can tell you how we did it in the old days. In some ways, sometimes the old days are best, right? The old ways are better. So I know a guy that I'm going to describe him, and I don't think either of you know him. He is a one-eyed mad Viking. And my one-eyed mad Viking used to be able to make a phone call and get somebody's stuff back because he was so feared in the hacker community that, like, no problem, we're really sorry, we'll walk away now. And that's really cool, but that's not scalable. So as we think about the things going forward, what do we do? What is the communication type? What is the... So I think it's funny that you mentioned Talon. I had a friend give a talk in Talon recently where the discussion was, what is cyber warfare? And part of this discussion comes to a point where we need to figure it out. It was Tara Wheeler. If you want to go look up her talk, it's actually on YouTube now. It's pretty good. But she talks about specifically the realities around some of these things that are horribly awkward when we think about the impact to accidental targets. She brings up, I don't know if she had the research on it yet, but there needs to be some research done on the statement, I think. China actually has avoided putting their droppers and their control mechanisms inside of hospitals. That speaks to their understanding that that would be a civilian target and consequently a war crime. And so as we think about these things, I hope as a human, we are willing to approach the things that we're talking about today as legitimate warfare, acts that we would do in war, acts in Bella that we would expect to be appropriate for the things that we're doing. And if so, then we should be civilized enough as humans to be able to say, this is inappropriate. We don't attack hospitals. This is inappropriate. We don't do some things that are just not right. We're not going to attack mom and pop's cheese shop in Padoigan because that's not a reasonable military target.
I think that's all fair. I mean, the war in Ukraine, again, going back to that example, just because of the sheer number of private sector companies that were assisting in that conflict, the International Committee on Red Cross was kind of leading this discussion and talking around town, like, what does this mean for a private sector company to be participating in this way during the war? Like, maybe your finger isn't directly on any type of trigger for anything, but like, if you're providing a threat feed into a government entity in Ukraine and that bit of intel or data is used to then inform a decision to take some type of kinetic action, are you considered a combatant? Who knows? And then to that end, okay, sure. If the answer is yes, then okay, X company that performed that action, are you still willing to participate? Are you willing to assume that risk? Maybe for that country, maybe for that region of the world, maybe not so much in Taiwan, right? I mean, it's very gray. It's a very different risk conversation, different levels of risk tolerance that companies are going to take. I mean, going back to this larger question of diplomacy and what it means to make these decisions on a global scale, it's like, what did I hear at RSA the whole time? Cybersecurity is national security. Well, I think cybersecurity is national security is economic security, right? All of these things are very much tied together. And so when you also consider commercial interests and their decisions to participate or not participate in these types of activities, that calculus there is going to vary across multiple different types of scenarios. And I think you're going to have a ton of variances. And to that end, when you think about an administration and what type of diplomatic tools they might want to employ to heat off China, it's in some cases a cybersecurity company or a CI owner and operator's opinion there might not matter at all.
Although I think the warfare piece is at the farther end of the spectrum. I go back to the 2012 to 2014, early 15 era, where we had a massive outflow of intellectual property from the Chinese attackers, all government attackers against U.S. companies. And it was IP theft predominantly. Even law firms were getting hit just to exfiltrate information about the cases and information in IP cases. And then we saw the wave of data breaches and all of that information about people, the Chinese OPM hack in 2014. And it was the series of IP thefts that led up to the Obama-Xi agreement in September of 2015, right? It had to reach this crescendo of, we're going to get a diplomatic solution here, or there's going to be some crisis. It feels like governments are still figuring out the metes and bounds of the cyber playing field, so they don't want to limit themselves. The IP space was where the United States and China said, enough. But I think the cyber weapon space, nobody wants to limit themselves. They're still trying to decide what the rules are. So companies are getting hit in the crosshairs, and I think ransomware and cyber extortion is a great example of that, where we're not stopping it because we're still looking at all of the upside for governments to figure out the other side of those tools. I hate the term dual use, but like the other side of some of these technologies. But does that resonate, that we're still trying to figure out the offensive rules of the road? So defense is hard.
How long have humans been walking on the planet at this point? We've been looking to kill each other since like day 2. So we keep finding new and horrible ways to do it. And this is the most new and horrible way to do it. And trust me when I tell you, like, yeah, if you give me a laptop in enough time, I can turn off all of the critical infrastructure that you need to keep breathing. It's
I mean,
not that
not
hard.
to be as dramatic as Nathan, but like, yes.
Oh,
I mean, what I say that
speaking of punches to the face.
I mean, but this is somewhat resonating with me, right? I mean, going back to the Obama-Xi agreement, like, yes. And did we actually see a real decline in IP theft from China? And has it been sustained over time? No, not so much. But also, I think there's a reluctance to come out and codify or be super definitive about what we won't do because, and not to get like different clandestine activities and thinking about different types of tradecraft in that in a classified space. But maybe there are things that we don't necessarily want to stop doing either, right? And not everybody is privy to what those things are. So yeah, there is a question about like, where are we going to start drawing those lines outside of what Nathan is saying about war crimes and, international crimes against humanity? I mean, yes, there is doctrine out there that governs some of that. But when it comes to what are you saying? No?
Yes, there is, but we're not listening to it. That's the point. Like, even at the most basic level of, hey, don't attack hospitals. Nah, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, though. Like, we haven't seen, knock on wood, a ransomware attack against a hospital where we actually saw a loss of life, right?
Not
like,
true.
We have.
Oh, is there a confirmed case now?
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. London, 2 years ago.
Oh, that was confirmed? Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess my point is, though, that, like, when is it dramatic enough to actually for other countries to start putting that stake in the ground? I don't know. I mean, that was kind of the argument for ransomware up until then, but I didn't realize that was fully confirmed.
Yeah.
So last question. If we had the opportunity to create a space for companies to be able to counteract some of the attack pressure that's coming at them, what should we be doing that we're not doing today? So if we were to grant an authority or give a capability that companies don't have, or if there's something that exists today that they're just not doing enough of, what would that be?
I don't think there's one single thing, Cristin, and I think it depends on what type of company we're talking about, what sector they're in, and what kind of target they are, right? Like, and for what actor. If I were to really zoom out, getting up to greater levels of basic cyber hygiene would be like my number one wish list, right? Like, yes, we are seeing some very mature, sophisticated attacks out here where we're like, holy shit, we had like, how did this happen, right? But then there are also other attacks here that are they're very basic and without something like just going to our principles, going to the NIST framework, looking at these basic security controls, thinking about things like network segmentation, zero trust, multi-factor authentication, right? Like, and then there's also the human factors, right? Training our people to think through what they're doing and using their systems and networks in a smart way. We still have a lot of growth to do there.
Nathan, how about you?
So there's so many things here that I would answer. I don't disagree with anything Stacy said. Please God in heaven, do everything she said. That said, to the point that Stacy made a second ago about who was the first person to get killed from a cyber action. And I got to tell you, one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now is we don't have a good way to define when somebody dies of cyber attack. So if you go actually look at the death certificate of what killed a person, there's a first and second order effect of the things that this made this person, maybe pneumonia, maybe like take your pick of thing, right? You don't have the opportunity clinically as hospitals around the world right now to select cyber attack as anything other than a third order of reason that somebody died. And the reality is in many cases, that statement about London is not actually the first. It's just the first that we can point at and say, absolutely, this is why. This person didn't get their blood because the entire system that was supposed to evaluate whether this person was supposed to get blood or not didn't happen. So they died from that. Great. So I get that it's stupid, but nomenclature. Just get to the point where we can all communicate about the same things so that we can agree on and consequently work as a corporate body and defend the crap out of ourselves right now. And we don't have the most basic of nomenclature to work with each other.
I love the diet and exercise cyber hygiene point, right? That is one that I cannot preach enough. And it comes back to a statistic that I used to get all the time when I was at the MSRC. 99% of the time when a computer is compromised, a patch was available, but it wasn't installed. So, Tom Cruise does not come through your ceiling. He doesn't have to. He can just walk in through the front door to compromise you. So I agree. Like, if we're going to stop offensive cyber actions, it's the basics that we have to invest in. But I do Nathan, the idea resonates a lot of combining or giving authorities and capabilities to law enforcement to be much more offensive or asynchronous in how they disrupt actors that are involved in cyber criminal activity. I think that has to change. The way in which we reward our law enforcement officials for bringing each one to justice in its slow and methodical way. I know that's how we've always worked, but that does not match the way in which we live anymore. And so we've got to figure out, how do we asynchronously disrupt while synchronously punishing for activity? And I think that is a longer, harder conversation to go solve for. But I've absolutely loved this conversation. I can't thank you guys enough because it's been terrific. It's a really hard topic. It's one that comes up every couple of years and is unsolved. And the depth and breadth of what we've covered today, it really reflects just how difficult this is to solve and why it's going to take a combination of diplomacy, technology, and I think good old-fashioned force of will to see if we can make some progress. So thank you, everybody, to listening to Advancing Cyber. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion and we've advanced some cyber along the way. I want to thank our guests, Nathan Case and Stacy O'Mara, and our Advancing Cyber team with managing support from D-Cyber Communication, our sound engineer, Louis Pialago, and our research interns, Layla Moeller, Yash Dutt, and Donnie Oliver. You can share ideas and recommendations via email at cyber@advancingcyber.com. Security is a community, and we always look forward to hearing from you. This is your host, Cristin Flynn Goodwin, saying thank you, patch your devices, and please turn on MFA.